C.
Yep.
Great. All right. Well, thanks so much to Ian and the North Canberra Community Council for, I'll go back, for inviting me to be part of this. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're on unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to their elders past and present. It's not lost on me that we're here tonight talking about how to organise and house ourselves on land that's been stolen. So I'm May Azizi. I'm the Deputy CEO of Anglicare Australia, and for the past 18 months, I've also been the spokesperson for the Everybody's Home campaign. For those who don't know about Everybody's Home, we're a campaign that's made up of 500 welfare, housing and homelessness organisations and also 43,000 average Australians, basically to tackle the housing affordability crisis. So I don't need to tell everybody here that Australia is in the midst of a very historic housing crisis. We've got, higher rates of housing stress than ever before. We've got 640,000 households around the country who need social housing but can't get it. We've got over 120,000 people who are homeless on any given night. And more people are being locked out of housing as the crisis really climbs the income ladder. I do just want to say something about using the word crisis, because from time to time people challenge me on the use of the word. I know it's a really politically charged word, crisis. It implies that there's a norm of acceptable, secure housing that meets people's needs, and it sort of suggests that we've strayed away from that norm in a way that couldn't have been predicted. I don't think that's true. I do think that the state of housing in Australia is the outcome of deliberate actions that have been taken by decision makers, especially at the federal level, and that the system is working the way it was designed to work. But I do like to use the language of crisis for the simple reason that I think it's the best way to describe how a lot of people are living, just really on the edge. We talk to renters in across the country who are just living in constant fear of eviction, sort of living in a constant state of precarity, constantly concerned about whether they can absorb the next rent increase. I know we've had some action on that here in the ACT, and just having to spend record amounts of housing and hang on to the leases that they've got with bloody fingernails, basically. So that's why I use the word crisis. So why is housing in crisis? I do like to start off here because I think where you think the crisis comes from really influences what you think the solutions are. And for years, the Australian government's solution to housing affordability in Australia was a very simple one. It built and supplied homes. That was part of a trend across Western countries to develop modern welfare states after World War II. The Commonwealth Housing Commission was created after by the Curtin government in 1943, and the Chifley government went on to build housing at really prodigious rates. Tens of thousands of public homes were stood up really quickly, built each year in the post-war era. And at its peak, about 1 in 4 new homes that was being built in Australia was being built by the government. And so the aim of that system was to provide affordable housing, not just to people who are at the margins, but to just working people, right? Average, everyday people. And the profile of people who were living in public housing back then was much more diverse than it is today, ranging from public servants, which we know a lot about the history of public servants living in public housing here in Canberra, but also all kinds of people in essential roles. I was really interested in what you were saying earlier, Jakeem. School teachers, construction workers, you name it, all these professions used to have housing supplied to them by the government. And the level of commitment to public housing it varied in the years after that, but the role of government in the housing market was really widely accepted for decades. As recently as the early 80s, about 1 in 3 renters in Australia was actually renting from the government. So this is a really big part of why housing was affordable in Australia in that sort of golden post-war era. In the 70s and 80s, public housing and government intervention really started to fall out of favour. Again, not unique to Australia. The post-Second World War sort of boom in public housing construction, not unique to Australia. Public housing falling out of favour in the 70s and 80s, also not straying from the norm there internationally. Different approaches started gaining popularity as the answer to improving living standards and building wealth, and it really sort of replaced that consensus that was built in the Second World War. And one of the things that was really interesting was in 1975, we had this landmark Royal Commission into Poverty in Australia, the Henderson Poverty Inquiry. And there is a whole section on it about how public housing needs to be better targeted. They had this identified it as a real problem, that only about 30% of people who were living in public housing were actually people in poverty and out of work. The vast majority of them were working people, not people in poverty. And this was identified as actually a problem, that public housing was being poorly targeted. So you can start to see the change in some of that thinking. So as the consensus shifted, the federal government really moved away from supplying housing itself and funding housing itself. Obviously, for as long as this has happened, I'm saying the federal government really funding state and territory governments to do a lot of this itself. So both in raw numbers and a percentage of overall homes, public housing really started to drop quickly. If you look, we did a bit of an analysis over summer, Everybody's Home, for a report that we did, and we found that in the early 80s, the federal government was spending about $165 per person on social housing, public housing as it was back then, and today it spends $61 per person. And when you adjust for inflation, that change is even more stark. Sorry, I've skipped over this by accident, but this is the graph. This is what that change looks like. So this is just in the last 40 years since the early 80s. And what we've seen instead is a real focus on supporting housing, like especially private rental, and that's really the bulk of where the federal government spends its money now. Spends and loses. I mean, depends on how you want to frame it. But
just one thing: is this analysis available on your website?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Yes, I can send this. I can actually send this to you.
That would be nice. That would be nice. Thanks.
Yeah. So in the mid-80s, you start to see the federal government introducing Commonwealth rent assistance, which at the time was really framed as something that was designed to save money on spending on housing, that will just support people to maintain private tenancies, and that's the best way to do things. Now, Commonwealth rent assistance is actually the main way that the government supports people through housing. It spends just under $5 billion a year on Commonwealth rent assistance and about $1.6 billion a year on social housing and homelessness combined. And then when you factor in the changes that were made in the late 90s to capital gains tax discount, this is a really big change, right? This is the sort of second prong. The first prong of why we're in crisis, from our campaign's perspective, is the decline in social housing and social housing density. And then the second prong is the very unfair distribution of housing in Australia. So in the 80s and 90s, government started looking around, realising that they weren't building housing anymore and wanting to really spur a bit more private investment. So we had the introduction of the capital gains tax discount in the late 90s. And I want to show you what, oh, no, that's not what we're doing. Oh, this is what that sort of led to. So you can see the impact that that's had on affordability for buying homes. And I think that's very widely accepted, the role that these tax concessions have played in pushing up house prices. But I think what's less understood is that they've also really pushed up rents because they've changed the profile of landlords in Australia. So if you look back to the 70s, 80s and 90s, most landlords in Australia, private landlords, were people who were positively geared, which means that they owned the home that they were investing in, and they were making a profit. The profit came from rent that they were charging. When you look at the changes that have been made, the tax changes that have been made, and the changes in the profile of who landlords are in the past couple of decades, they're now mostly negatively geared, and a lot of them are very, very, very highly leveraged. You didn't used to see these like 10% rent increases every single year. We've had rent increases. Asking rents have actually gone up by about 75% since the start of the pandemic across Australia. So that's from March 2020 to today. That's an enormous rent increase, and we just never used to see asking rents increase by these kinds of amounts back when you had more positively geared landlords. So I think that's an underappreciated aspect of the tax debate. I do want to go back and show this. I don't want to do death by graphs. I've only got a couple. I've been told that I do too many of them. But this just sort of shows you the change in how the federal government spends its money. So support, you can see, used to be, you know, primarily for social housing, public housing, and then since the 90s, public and community housing. Now we can see that the vast majority of what the government spends, like orders of magnitude more, is supporting market housing through tax concessions and also Commonwealth rent assistance. So
hang on, where is the 2010 peak in
that is the global financial crisis. The Rudd government did a big stimulus, and social housing was a really big part of that. It was you can see that was a genuinely extremely significant amount of money. The other thing I should say is that this graph doesn't go up to last year, but there was a big injection into social housing last year that the government announced as part of its negotiations with the Greens around the Housing Australia Future Fund. That was $3 billion that was like a one-off injection to social housing, which is the most money as a one-off injection that social housing has seen since the global financial crisis. So we see these little peaks, but we aren't seeing like sustained changes in the way the federal government funds social housing. So this is just another way of presenting that. This is the last graph, I promise. But this just shows you the composition of where the federal government is spending that money. So a fair whack of that is Commonwealth rent assistance, but it's also revenue foregone from negative gearing and revenue foregone from capital gains tax discount. So the federal government is really spending a lot of money to produce housing outcomes that are bad and extremely expensive. So a few things have happened as a result of the changes in the kind of the behaviour of the federal government. The really big change is that in response to the way the federal government funds social housing is that state and territory governments have really restricted who is eligible for social housing. It used to be much more universally available, and it's now really for people at the absolute margins. The tax system very unfairly distributes the homes that we have, and as I mentioned before, pushes the wrong landlords into the system to become providers of housing. And the thing to say about that is there's a lot of talk in Australia. I didn't want to do yet another graph because I didn't want to do death by graph, but we do have an oversupply of housing in Australia, and a lot of people don't believe me when I say that. We have an oversupply in virtually every region of Australia compared to our needs and demographics. And if you look at a graph that I cut out of this presentation, we're actually doing pretty well in terms of homes per person by international standards. We're in like the top 5 of OECD countries, and we've never had more homes per person than we have now. So that number has consistently been climbing at every single census since the early 90s. We are building a lot of housing, but the housing has never been less fairly distributed than it is today, and tax is a really, really big part of that. But just inequality more broadly is a big part of that story. So there's an urgent need for reform, which is why our campaign exists. The cost of these tax concessions is going to keep going up. The Parliamentary Budget Office has projected that they're going to cost over $150 billion over the next decade. But the thing to know about that is, interest rates have been have gone up a few times since that estimate was done. There has been a recent update, so I should update this slide deck to reflect that. But because landlords deduct their costs, including their interest rate repayments, that just gets more and more expensive the higher the interest rates go. So we're directing an awful lot of money into housing that's basically just designed to constantly get more and more expensive. We modelled over summer, again, this is a report that I can send you guys afterwards, that could fund about half 500,000 social homes, 500,000 social homes. And for context, we've got 640,000 people who are waiting for social housing. We're building like less than 3,000 social housing dwellings each year, and that doesn't take into account how much we're losing, because a lot of that social housing is getting built through like renewal projects. So state governments, New South Wales and Victoria, are proposing to stand down a lot of their existing, like decommission a lot of their existing public housing, as they're also building new dwellings. So we've again calculated that at the rate we're at, it's going to take 200 years to clear the social housing shortfall that we've got. So we're not getting very far. We've got a couple of different asks for our campaign. The first one is homes on investment. So that's fixing the unfair tax system. That's phasing out capital gains tax discount and negative gearing deductions over 10 years. We're open to different ways to do that. Our ask, for various reasons, is just to phase it out altogether. But we're definitely open to other proposals around it. There are proposals, for example, to limit negative gearing deductions to just one investment property. There are proposals to use negative gearing to sort of target investment in social and affordable housing, get landlords into investing in social housing. That's one way to do it. Our campaign is really about moving the needle and changing the conversation, which I'll get into in subsequent slides. So that's the reason why we just say phase it out altogether. The second thing that we're calling for is governments to take responsibility. So aiming for 10% social housing. It's going to take a long time to get there, and really concerted political will. One of the very frustrating things watching the way the federal government engages in this debate is they're constantly trumpeting their, this Housing Australia Future Fund. They've got a target of building 30,000 homes over 5 years. That doesn't replace the same number of homes that we're actually set to lose over the next 5 years in social housing. So we're still not really getting further ahead. But one of the problems that we've got is, if we're just aiming to clear that backlog and fill the waiting list, social housing is never going to be cost effective for state governments. One of the reasons why we were able to have such great social housing density in decades past is because you had people who were earning an income, paying into the system and actually paying rent, whereas we have many fewer people in the system now who actually pay rent, and the system is a lot more expensive to maintain. The last thing, and this is something where we've seen the government and the ACT make some modestly good strides on, is some renters' rights, make renting fair. So that's limiting unfair rent increases. The ACT has got the best system in the country, but it's still pretty weak by international standards. So we've got now a regime where rent increases are limited by 10% over CPI, which I would like that to be just CPI. But it is the only jurisdiction that's actually limited the amount of rent increases. We've seen other jurisdictions limit the frequency of rent increases, but that's not the same as limiting the amount of rent increases. We need to end no-cause evictions around the country. We need some independent enforcement of renters' rights, because right now in most parts of the country, the onus is really on renters to take their landlords to a tribunal when something goes wrong, which for lots of reasons is just a complete misunderstanding of the power dynamic between the renter and the landlord. So there's a few things about the current political context. I get told again and again all the time that especially the tax ask is completely unrealistic. There's a narrative that's formed about why federal Labor lost the election in 2019 that says that tax reform is completely responsible. I disagree with that completely. Labor took negative gearing and capital gains tax reform to the federal election in 2016 and won 14 seats. There are a lot of reasons why parties lose elections, and I think we've seen just in the last couple of years that there's been a real increase in the appetite for reform. We commissioned some polling from Redbridge, our campaign, earlier this year, and we found that about 2/3 of people support winding back negative gearing tax concessions. And there's actually been a lot of consistency. We asked people, about different sort of scenarios, limiting, phasing out, limiting to one investment property, and all up 2/3 of respondents supported the change. But Essential, which is the pollster that the Guardian uses, have done 3 polls on this in the last year, and they've all shown majority support for reform. And Fairfax has also run a poll that's shown majority support. So I think it's not really right to say that this isn't supported. I think we're just in one of these situations where the people who oppose change have more political power than the majority of people who are actually pretty open to change. I should say, actually, per capita, the Labor-aligned think tank in Melbourne has done some polling that's specifically aimed at landlords, understanding landlord behaviour and landlord opinion. And they find that people who own one property or less actually have pretty distinguishable attitudes from people who aren't property investors at all. It's really when you've got a property portfolio that you start to I guess coalesce around some views that are a bit more hostile to some of these changes. So our campaign has got a theory of change about how we go about challenging some of the unhelpful ideas that exist around housing. And the first is challenging the dominant public narrative. I think you guys have touched on this quite a bit in the discussion that you were having with Joe before I started speaking. One of the things that's been really disturbing to me in the past 18 months since I've taken on this role is the way developers who are a big part of why we're having a housing crisis in Australia, are framing themselves as the solution to the crisis, and the extent to which a lot of people are really going along with that. One of the big issues that we've got in Australia is that building more homes without doing something to equitably and fairly distribute those homes is not going to make housing more affordable. There is no country in the world and no city in the world that has made housing more affordable by reforming zoning laws. It just hasn't happened. The proponents of that kind of argument, the evidence they point to doesn't actually show rents going down. It shows rents going up by not quite as much as they speculate they otherwise might have. And even if there's a lot of holes in the research around it, but even if you take their best case scenarios, it's going to be 45 years before we make a dent in affordability by just building by just adding a bunch of housing stock. And that's not how you manage a crisis. I'm 38 years old, and if I had a child tomorrow, they would be middle-aged and older than I am now before they see a meaningful dent on affordability. If we just rely on that route, you need to do something to equitably distribute the homes that you build, and government needs to play a substantial role. Again, I haven't seen any examples of a country that has either avoided its housing crisis altogether or turned it around without the government being a significant player in building and supplying housing. The second thing that we want to do is building a constituency for the changes that we need. So I talked earlier about, why is it that there's this perception that the tax changes in particular are unpopular with the electorate. You know, when we can demonstrate fairly consistent political support, especially for the past couple of years, I think the answer is just about the power of the different constituencies. You've got one constituency that's a majority of people, and you've got another constituency that's just a really noisy and powerful minority, that's got a lot more political power and a lot more clout and is truly organised in a way that people who need housing to live in aren't. And so that relates to the last thing that we want to do, which is mobilising our supporters, especially ahead of this next election, and using our power to really directly put some pressure on decision makers. I won't go too much into a lot of this, but we are doing.
There's also a problem of time. So maybe
yes, I'll wrap it up. I don't actually have much to go on. I covered it mostly in that slide, but I will just say I think there are two sort of big narratives that need challenging in this debate, and the first one is really about the role of like private housing, and is building more of it really going to achieve what we want to achieve? I think the concern I have about that is that there are a lot of people reinforcing the view that the current federal government has, which is that it doesn't actually need to do anything. You know, it doesn't need to build more social housing. It doesn't need to change the tax system. It just needs to make it possible for the private sector to build more homes, and then blame other levels of government when that doesn't happen, which, you know, is appealing to them for a lot of reasons. And I think the second thing that I'm a bit concerned about is the lack of skepticism about the capacity of the private sector to meet our housing needs without actual regulation, distribution, and you know, government action around that. I think I'll just end it there and see if you've got any questions. I've got my email address there, by the way, if anyone has any questions or wants to get in touch.
thanks. Here's May. That was awesome. And never ever apologize for a graph, because it's the most potent way to show what's happening. I don't know who discourages you to use graphs.
Everyone I work with, anyway.
No. Ian, you are muted, my friend. Hello.
Hey.
Now.
How's that?
Yep.
Fabulous. Sorry about that. Fabulous presentation, May, and I agree with Joachim. There's nothing sexier than a really good infographic, let me tell you. So a couple of things, just a couple of facts. I think you should hold governments accountable for the level of social housing provision. Like if you look at the 2018 ACT housing strategy, there's an intro by the Minister for Housing where she outlines that the government's going to really have a great renewed focus on providing social housing in the ACT. 2018, 15% of all new developments will be social housing. I think someone's got to call the government to account on that. If they've produced 2% of social housing during that time, I'd be amazed, because when you look at the stats on social housing, it's gone backwards dramatically over the last probably decade to 20 years. So that's an appalling outcome for a territory which has the second highest prices for housing and for rent. Look, you know, I've lived around the country and lived around the world, but for Canberra to be the second highest rent and housing prices in Australia, I just can't understand it. It's Canberra. Like, is this for real? It's not New York. The other thing is, I think the idea around government becoming a builder, and that's something that the Greens are thinking about as well. And I think that's really important, because government, as you say in your presentation, did have a really big role in the provision of housing, and that did have a tangible impact on the housing market. I think analysis has shown that if government produces 20% of housing that's built in any one year, that'll have a definite impact on market prices, both for housing and for rent. And I think we need to get past the neoclassical idea that the private market does it well, because clearly this housing crisis has shown market failure. So I was just wanting you to increase your, your 10% goal to 20%, and maybe ask Joe as well, what's happened to the government's housing promise of 15% social housing?
Well, I agree. I agree. I mean, I would love to see 20, 30%, 40% public housing. I mean, in Austria, it's 60% public housing, right? In Australia, the only jurisdiction that has actual mandatory inclusionary zoning is the city of Sydney, and it's 1%. In France, it's 40%, right? Like these are the kinds of numbers that we need to be looking at if we're going to make a really meaningful dent, in turning around our housing crisis. So I agree completely. I don't know if Joe has anything to say about the housing strategy, but I think it's a bit unfair to make Joe answer for the Minister for Housing.
I won't answer for the Minister for Housing, but I'll endorse and validate the comments. We've gone backwards. The Greens took housing seriously, and we asked for 400 additional homes this term. We haven't had them. We've gone backwards through the group program, and we're not going to get them this term. We're told we're going to get them by 2026, and frankly, 400 was way too low. The lesson we've learned from that is we're going in saying we need 10,000. That's a more realistic number for what we need over 10 years. That's, we've got a really tangible plan behind that. But you're absolutely right. We've gone backwards. We've done a fair bit of calling out in recent weeks. We've been doing a whole lot of FOIs on every time Housing AST knocks back housing that they're offered. It happens a lot. We've done a fair bit of AST Housing didn't put in a single application for HAF funding for public housing in the first round. So we're obviously not going to get any public housing under that because they didn't apply for any. So I think it has been poor performance.
Leon.
May, we have an ACT election coming up in October. How can we vote for you?
Oh, well, that comment has made my night. Unfortunately, well, I'm not running in this election, so I'm afraid you can't. But I have to say, I mean, the proposal to build 10,000 public homes. I'm interested in seeing Joe, and I'd be really interested in whether you've heard much from Labor about what their social housing plans are ahead of the election, or if they've come out with anything, because that is the kind of scale that we need to be looking at. 10,000 homes would be 1 in 4 new constructions, just looking at kind of building patterns in Canberra, which is where we were when we were really meaningfully building up public housing really quickly in Australia. And it's also good to see that buying is part of that component as well. I mean, I think one of the questions we get a lot is how on earth do you build like 500,000 or 640,000 or all these numbers that we throw around social homes? Well, the federal government's got a target to build 1.2 million homes, and my view is that if you can build private housing, you can build social housing. There's not a difference. There's not like a special different other kind of builder who builds social housing. But you can also buy homes, and that's also a really good and useful way of expanding social housing stock really quickly.
Marcus.
Yeah, thanks. Just a few thoughts of my own on this topic. It seems as if the problem with housing, and it's a problem all the way across the world, is that people have realized that they can treat housing as a business, and people have bought up houses and they rent it out, and because everyone needs somewhere to live. And once you start treating things as a business, you can, things can happen in terms of monopolies, market power, and there's a whole lot of sort of negative consequences to that. Now, that's not to say that that shouldn't be a business, but I think like the root cause of this problem is that people are treating housing like a business to some extent.
Yes.
Then the sort of your ideas about changing the tax system around negative gearing and capital gains tax, to me, I mean, I'm more persuaded by the arguments that if you do incur a cost in a business, that should be tax deductible as part of the income from that business, and that's the way that our tax system works, and there's reasons for that. And in terms of capital gains, I'm not exactly sure why the capital gains tax is set as it is, but I get the impression that it's somewhat to do something with international competitiveness, that we have our capital gains tax like it is. And I'm not an expert in tax, but I sort of get that impression. But to me, it seems like one of the solutions, and I think the ACT government has done this quite well, is that we actually have a land tax on rental property, which actually discourages people from buying up lots of property and renting it out. And actually, since you put a tax on it, it discourages this sort of business, or at least the government gets money from these businesses, which it can then direct through to social housing and dealing with some of the negative externalities of this housing as a business problem. So in some ways, I think the ACT government's done a really good job there, and we haven't quite got the massive property gains like they have in Sydney to the same extent in Canberra. Property prices have gone up, but looking at some of the prices in Sydney, it's astronomical. And just from my own personal perspective, I don't own any rental properties in the ACT exactly because of the land tax reason. Everyone can get one house and that's about it. And you're really discouraged from owning multiple houses. So yeah, they're my thoughts. Do you want to sort of comment or respond to any of that? Or
yeah, I mean, I will say the tax treatment of housing in Australia is one of the things that's really unique to us internationally. I push back on the idea that a lot of the patterns around housing in Australia are unique. They're actually kind of fairly typical of a lot of comparable countries. But the tax system, situation, I should say, is extremely unique to both Australia and New Zealand. The tax treatment of both capital gains and also negative gearing, to deduct losses on property, extremely unique to Australia and New Zealand, right? Not a lot of other countries have this. And also not a lot of other countries have such a crippling dependence on like random average people to supply housing. This is not how housing is supplied in most other countries. You have a lot more institutional investors, which come with their own, that comes with its own issues, but it resolves some issues as well when there's someone who can supply housing at scale and isn't necessarily making these big losses and isn't so highly leveraged. So we've really used the tax system to bring random average people into supplying housing in Australia, and I think that's unfair to the people who are living in the system and trying to rent, also trying to buy and compete with investors to buy homes. But it's also a lot of demands to make on like the investors, right? If they're just average people and they're investing in housing to make a bit of extra money, it's really not surprising that they turn around and push back on any kind of like rental standard, any kind of minimum rental standards, any kind of limits on rent increases. It hurts them, and it's difficult for them to absorb it, and that's just a consequence of the way, this crazy way the government has chosen to supply housing in Australia. I mean, I think the answer is like invest in something else, like don't become a supplier of housing. This is the thing that landlords ask me these kinds of questions all the time about, well, how am I supposed to do this or that? And I kind of just say, maybe you should really take the time and think about whether you should be supplying an essential service like housing to someone else. Because, when you look at the way we regulate things like utilities and electricity, and other things that we consider to be essential services in Australia, it's actually incredibly difficult to get your water turned off or your electricity turned off. Your electricity company, if you failed to pay, they're actually obliged to go to you and ask if you want to enter into a payment plan. They're obliged to offer you hardship options. It's like double digits of people in the ACT. Like, that's how small it is of people who get their water and electricity disconnected. It's really difficult. It is much easier to evict someone from their home than it is to turn off their water or their electricity. And I think that's just a symptom of who supplies the product here in Australia. You mentioned one of the things, and I wanted to touch on this too, the commodification of housing and turning housing into a business, which I completely agree with, and it's one of the things that needs to change. But you also see this really extend to kind of the language of consumer preferences. One of the things that people tell me all the time when I talk about the way housing is unfairly distributed is they talk about like changing consumer preferences and smaller household sizes and things like this. Firstly, I think it's not really true. People on higher incomes are living in smaller households. People on low and middle incomes are living in the same or larger households than I've ever lived in before. They don't have the luxury of choosing to take up more space in the way that wealthier people do. But it's also this bizarrely passive way of talking about housing. I did a presentation similar to this a few weeks ago with a housing academic from the University of South Australia, and he said some good stuff, and most of it was stuff that I agreed with, but he finished with this really baffling slide about how Australia has a mismatch because we have all these people who don't have like enough housing. They don't have the room that they need, they're in unsuitable conditions, they can't afford where they live, etc. And then we have all of these people who have like excess housing and extra rooms. And I thought that was such an interesting way to put it, because it's not how we talk about anything else. It's not how you would describe wealth or income. We have this mismatch where some people have a bunch of extra money and other people don't have enough money. Isn't that strange? It's a mismatch. No, that's inequality. And the answer to that question is to do something redistributive about it, So yeah, I agree with what you were saying about kind of commodification of housing, but also the way that's sort of really led us in an unconscious way to think about it as a consumer good and view it through the lens of preferences rather than needs.
Ernestine.
Thank you. One thing that really resonated with me was your comment about just building more housing and changing zoning to encourage more housing isn't a solution. I was wondering whether Greater Canberra had spoken with you at all, or whether you'd had any contact with them, because that's very much what Greater Canberra pushes all the time, that just more houses is the solution.
I have talked to Greater Canberra. I was actually kind of optimistic that we might be able to find a way to do something together ahead of the ACT election. But, everything I sort of put to them, they weren't really, zoning can be incredibly useful to the extent that it leads to more social housing and more housing that people can afford, but they're really of the view that there shouldn't be any obstacles to people who want to build. I talked to them about putting something forward at the ACT election together about mandatory inclusionary zoning, and they really weren't interested in that either. I'm not against building. And I think the people who sort of self-identify as YIMBYs actually do have some really good and useful ideas about urban design and sustainability and the way cities can grow in a way that's sustainable. What I think they're wrong about is the role of the private sector. And I think that's definitely been a sticking point in terms of like how and whether we can work together.
Yeah, so I just appreciated your insight on that. And certainly within Braddon and the group I'm involved in, Braddon, we're very much, densification is the solution, but not at the expense of livability and walkability. That's our key focus.
Sure. Well, Braddon is also ground zero for some of these. I was looking to buy a couple of years ago myself, and I saw a few places that just didn't seem to have any natural sunlight in them. And I can tell you those places weren't cheap. So this idea that they bring down costs, and the idea that you just build a lot in this one area and costs go down, that doesn't seem to be happening in Braddon, does it? I mean, it's,
And not these large developments on Northbourne Avenue, for example, have an affordable housing component. So, but we'll leave it there. I just wanted to ask if you'd spoken to Greater Canberra. That was all. So thank you.
Just before I ask Marianne, so there are three things with housing. One is funding, the other one is land, and the third one in the moment is bottlenecks in builders and building material. We've talked with Joe about land, like this example of reclaiming land for housing. But Joe also dug up something really weird during her parliamentary committee, and that is that ACT Housing, so that would be the Agency for Public Housing and Social Housing and so on, has to pay market rates for the land on which to build public and social housing. And that is not right.
I agree it's not right. And I can't help but feel like the government could change that if it wanted to. Yeah, okay. I'm glad you're nodding in it's reassuring. I hear those things, and they sound sort of arbitrary to me. It's like, oh, if only government could make the rules and then change them, because I'm pretty sure they can.
It's just one fairly unknown thing that I think we should hammer in the election when coming up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Marianne.
Oh, I'll be quick. Mele, it was an absolutely brilliant presentation. Thank you very much. It's very enlightening. And yes, keep on with the graphs. I completely agree. Forget those other people. We love graphs. I did notice at the end that I think you're associated with Anglicare.
Yes.
I think this is quite an extraordinary thing for a particular religious group to take on board, and I congratulate them. And therefore I will say, how are you going with trying to gather a group of concerted other religions to also adopt this attitude and try and silence some of the shrill lobbies that so much dominate the press and the social media and so forth? Are you getting any kind of buy-in from the Sallies and the Muslim groups, etc.? Are you working any kind of national arrangement here with other religious groups?
Yeah, that's a really good point. We are part as Anglicare of something called the Major Church Providers, but that is sort of church groups: the Salvation Army, St. Vincent de Paul, Uniting Care, Baptist Care, Catholic Social Services, and the like. But we haven't actually explored doing something multi-faith. That's a really good idea. I will say one of the things that I sort of very excitedly tried to get off the ground when I first started at Anglicare was thinking about church land, but
that was going to be my next.
Anglicare is not connected, unfortunately, to the I was very quickly frustrated in my efforts to find, cool and creative uses for church land. And church jealously guards their land. Although there are instances, and in Queensland, the church is doing a mix of giving land to Anglicare agencies to develop social housing, which is great. And then in other parts of Queensland, curiously objecting to social housing that's going on near, anyway. Yes, so it's yes, that is interesting. I haven't actually explored doing anything with other sort of interfaith groups or agencies. The Christian groups have much more sort of established social welfare arms, and again, sort of a land for a base of land to go off and do works. And many of us are also providers of community housing. Yeah, but that is a good point, and that's something to look into.
Oh, thank you.
Look, folks, it's 9:15. This was an amazing pair of discussions. I'm really glad that Ian managed this this general meeting, and I really thank Joe and Mai for coming around. There's much more to discuss, but it was really inspiring, and we will consider in NCCC how we can continue to contribute to that discussion. So thanks heaps. And I'll take the last 10 minutes to go through some NCCC business issues. So thanks heaps for coming.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your encouragement about the graphs. I've found my people. Yeah.
I'm a scientist, you know.
Give me a graph too.